Hello and welcome to episode 10 of the Parliament Podcast. I'm your host Andy Sagadan, online managing editor of TLR Volume 91. On today's episode, we welcome Pennsylvania Representative Mike Zabel. The former TLR staffer will share with us what's going on in Harrisburg regarding several pieces of proposed gun control legislation. He'll also shed some light on some of the politics that accompany such hotly contested subjects. We hope that you find our conversation informative and enjoy. We are very excited to welcome District 163 Representative Mike Zabel to the podcast today. Representative Zabel serves municipalities in Delaware County, including Drexel Hill, Clifton Heights, Alden, and Havertown. He is a 2010 graduate of Temple Law School and served as a staff editor on Volume 82. He's here today to talk to us about a host of gun laws that have been proposed in Harrisburg and how he expects that gun conversation, which is occurring nationally, to proceed at the state level. We have a lot to talk about. So without further ado, welcome Representative Zabel. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. It's fun to be here. I have fond memories of Temple Law Review, which if you're in law review right now, you might say, "Really, you remember that fondly?" But my wife and I we weren't married at the time, but we spent a lot of our time working together on law review, working on the write-on competition and all of that. So it was a crucible that brought me and my wife together. So I think of it fondly.
Well, I'm glad that something good came out of it, and that Temple Law Review brings people together. We should maybe do like a Valentine's Day ad next year. Now, I guess you're speaking of Temple Law Review, and I know, as I mentioned, I know the gun debate is hugely debated across the country. So I want to focus our conversations on that. But before we do, I do want to talk a little bit about your time at Temple Law Review, because I'm curious for those out there who may be interested in politics, maybe interested in state representation, maybe interested in legislation more generally. I guess how you kind of made your way from that TLR office with your now wife 9-10 years ago to where you are in Harrisburg today.
Well, it's a good question. I definitely did not graduate Temple with the specific intention of running for office one day. When I graduated Temple, my intention was to go out and become the best advocate, the best attorney that I could be, do work that interested me, work that I believed in, and just go out there. I liked to make an argument, whether it was on the written page or it was standing up in front of a courtroom or in front of a group of people. I liked advocating for a cause. I liked doing good, and I thought I could have a future in it. So that's when I graduated law school. That was sort of where my head was at. I'll also never forget a teacher I had at the time from Temple, who's now the provost of Temple. At the time, she was the dean of the law school, Dean Epps, Joanne Epps, who she was teaching us a criminal procedure class. And she said to us as a big class, she said, I want you to remember, no matter what, with your law degree, no matter what you do, you have an obligation to help people with your law degree, which really resonated with me. It's a message that I also, in my high school, which is not too far from Temple, the high school I went to, St. Joseph's Prep, one of the things they instill in their students is you're supposed to go out there and be a man for others, a person for others. That you take your skills, you take your abilities, and you go out and it's used to help people. So ultimately, I was an attorney, and still I'm an attorney, but I was practicing as an attorney for a number of years, but I've always felt that call to public service. And it just so happened at the end of 2017, 2018, the opportunity for me to run for office came, and given the political situation that we were in, I thought it was frankly, my responsibility to at least give it a try, to run for office, because I believed I could help people. I believed I could do a good job, and that's how I wound up in it. I did not come out of law school with the intention of getting a law degree to go run for office someday. It was a circuitous path, like so many times the best paths are.
And I guess following up on that, another quick question, especially considering this is something that you didn't really plan for necessarily, and that you're new to it. I think it might be helpful for framing our discussion as well. A lot of us in law school, maybe, and I'm speaking to my own ignorance, we'll read a law, we'll interpret what it means, or use case law to interpret what it means, and maybe we never really think about how that law, except for maybe the Schoolhouse Rock, YouTube clips, how that law materialized. I guess obviously gun laws that we're going to be talking about a lot today are more contentious maybe than your average bill. But what has drafting legislation taught you about the law as a lawyer? As your kind of your calling, and I guess what aspects may a typical civilian not appreciate about what it takes to even the simplest, you think everybody's on board with this, getting that through Harrisburg.
It's funny being a lawyer in Harrisburg, whether it's in Harrisburg or Washington, D.C., lawyers sometimes don't, people like to bag on the profession or, there's too many lawyers in Harrisburg or D.C., and that's probably so. On the other hand, I feel like having been a lawyer in practice for a number of years makes me a much better legislator. And I think law school is good practice, or what the skills that you pick up in law school are also helpful to being a legislator, because I think up here in Harrisburg I found that sometimes legislators are not always fully thinking. That's not right. Sometimes lawmakers don't always appreciate what will happen once this written law is put out there into the court system, or put out into the world and then interpreted in the court system. The having practiced and having seen out there, I'm sure we even did this in law school, you can have a lengthy debate about the placement of a comma and what this whole law means based on a comma, or based on whether you use the word or, and, all these sort of things. And that sort of precision in what you put on a piece of paper is very important. And I'm on the Judiciary Committee right now up in Harrisburg, and I'm very lucky and grateful to do that, because it's fun, legally minded stuff. But I've had already a number of contentious private debates, and even sometimes in committee hearings had some debates about language in a particular bill that once we release it out into the world, once you release it out into the world, it's the legislator, it's beyond your control, and you can't go back and tell a court or something, well, no, what we really meant was this. It needs to be written in a way that the intent is clear. And sometimes we do a great job with that. Sometimes we don't do a great job with it. I have litigated enough cases as a lawyer and studied them enough at Temple to know that your words do matter. You can't always foresee every problem, but you've got to try to imagine how it will play out for a judge or an attorney or somebody who's trying to make sense of this law. And some people are really good at it, but it's a big benefit, I think, to come from that background and realize that your words are supremely important when it comes to drafting legislation.
Now you have, and I guess the remainder of our conversation will be about specific pieces of gun legislation, which there's a lot out there right now that's in Harrisburg at varying degrees of going through the channels. And you yourself have sponsored a number of bills on this regard that we'll also talk about. But I think the first thing I want to talk about is you just mentioned that you're on the House Judiciary Committee, and right now there's HR 768, which is a gun registration bill, essentially requires annual application, including photographs, fingerprinting of gun owners. This bill has been grabbing a ton of headlines across the state lately, and has both been lauded. It's been described as unconstitutional. Has some of your colleagues have described it as having no chance of passing through the Judiciary Committee. I guess before we get into your specific pieces of legislation, I guess this one being one that's kind of making its ways and is in the committee right now, I guess what do you expect to transpire in the coming weeks and months?
I do want to add first with regards to this bill, because I am familiar with it. It is not unconstitutional. I think there's been that's a messaging that comes from the gun manufacturing lobby. They say pretty much any type of gun regulation is unconstitutional. But in fact, the circuit courts of the United States federal system have been upholding gun regulations like these for years and years and years, and the Supreme Court has been denying certiorari on these. The Supreme Court has made clear, and Justice Scalia did in Heller, the Heller opinion, that we can regulate firearm ownership just like we can regulate speech and not violate the First Amendment. So we can regulate firearm ownership and not vitiate the Second Amendment. So, and I do not believe that the 768, which is the registration bill, I do not believe for a second that is unconstitutional. Now, with that said, I do not expect this bill to be introduced in committee, and I don't expect it will ever be called up for a vote. I don't believe that there's interest enough there in the committee or in the majority party at large to introduce that bill.
And I guess just reading through, and I guess with that in mind, I think what your answer there, where you believe that it's not unconstitutional, you just don't feel as though it has the the support or the oomph to get through. I guess reading news articles, and maybe this kind of colors the picture for the rest of our conversation. I think depending on the region of the publication that you're reading, in terms of news articles on 768, the official quoted, the opinion can vary very widely. And I think it's a reminder of how politically and socially diverse Pennsylvania is more generally. And we'll talk about specific examples in a moment. But how do you see this debate? This is, I guess, one piece of legislation that you believe is at least constitutional, but maybe not, doesn't have support. But I guess in terms of looking at each piece of individual legislation on this, I guess how do you have a state where there's staunch conservatives and bleeding heart liberals, in some cases living a few miles apart. How do you kind of see this all relatively coming together?
I think we have a pretty sharp divide right now in the state. Pennsylvania is a pretty diverse state. It's not unlike America. I think you're right to recognize that generally the positions are polarized between more rural areas and more suburban/urban areas. In fact, it tends to split more cleanly along those lines than it does Republican and Democrat when it comes to gun violence. With that said, I think we need to shift the cultural conversation, the social conversation about this, in order to build up support for measures that address gun violence. For too long, the gun manufacturing lobby, through their mouthpiece, the NRA, has really controlled this by driving fear in people. And they do this to sell guns. Every time, when President Obama took office, he's always coming to take away your firearms. And they do that because every time something like that happens, they drive on fear and gun sales rise. Gun sales rise every time the NRA, there's a tragedy. When President Obama was elected, there's a spike in sales, and they use that to their advantage. I think there's grounds for more there's a lot more common ground or potential for it with people than we realize, but we have to start moderating the conversation or bringing people to a middle ground and understanding that, well, let's say that someone has been deemed an extreme risk by their families, and they're worried about this family member. He's displayed violent tendencies, and we're afraid he's going to act out. Something like an extreme risk protection order is not an unreasonable thing for a family member to be able to go and petition for. And there's actually a bipartisan bill in both the House and the Senate that purports to address that. And that is not, when you talk to people one-on-one, most people are pretty reasonable about this kind of thing. There are always going to be some people that say no way, no how, no anything. And there are going to be some people who say there shouldn't be any firearms at all. Well, the truth is there's a Second Amendment, so that's in our Constitution. That's not going anywhere. So and the United States Supreme Court has said we have the right to own a handgun in our home for self-defense. That's what Heather says. So that's not going anywhere. So there's that extreme, and then there's the other extreme which says you can't regulate whatsoever. And I think that extremism has had too heavy an influence in the social conversation. This is like anything else. There's room in the middle, but we have to start calling out that extremism as what it is. Extremism. It's. I had someone describe, for example, the use of an AR-15, which is a mass shooter's weapon of choice in America and abroad. Say, well, no, it's one of the great things about the AR-15 is that it's easy for women and children to shoot because there's no recoil. And that was one of his reasons for justifying its existence. And I think we can have a conversation where we're saying, look, I understand people who want to hunt, they don't use an AR-15. In terms of a self-defense weapon at home, it's not. That's not what people need. An AR-15 is a weapon that's designed to shoot people quickly and easily. And maybe those are the ones that we should have. Just like you can't own a sawed-off shotgun.
Mm-hmm.
And people kind of accept that now, or you can't own a machine gun. Maybe there are other classes of weapons that really don't serve any purpose other than facilitating murder. But we've got to be able to win. I think we have to change the cultural conversation on that before we have a chance at really moving substantial gun violence legislation. Because right now it is such a polarized issue, and the NRA has really done a good job of making it a fear-driven issue rather than a reason-driven issue. And I think that's something that we have to fight back with on just a simple social cultural level. And of course, we're going to continue to work on it at the legislative level, but we've got to build support because it can't just be, I don't want gun violence to be thought of as a liberal or progressive issue versus a conservative issue. I'd like progressive and conservative to be a financial or economic debate, and let's have gun violence be something that we can find some middle ground on. I may favor more stringent regulation than someone else, but we have to at least understand that we can absolutely regulate firearms, and we have to.
And I guess we're moving to your personal bills that you've sponsored. And I don't think we can do them all justice in our small amount of time. As you all know, you've been very active on this front. But I would roughly separate them, and maybe you disagree with how I'm separating them, but into, I guess, bills that would deal with gun ownership, bills that deal with gun safety, and perhaps bills that are trying to adapt the law, to evolving technology. And I want to ask you about them each more generally in a minute. But first, I guess I'm curious as to what made this an issue you seemed to focus a lot of your attention on. I'm not trying to you sponsored a lot of legislation, not necessarily just gun bills, but this does seem to be a issue that you've paid a lot of attention to. And I'm curious, is this something that's about personal belief? Is it the media reports? Is it something constituents are talking to you about? I know you mentioned there's maybe some lack of clarity in how some of these things work. I guess what has kind of made this something that you've been very active in recent months?
I am determined not to become numb, and for us as a society, not to become numb and accepting of these mass shootings that feel like they happen every couple months or so. I reject the idea that there's nothing we can do about them. I believe that I reject the premise that it's either you address mental health or you address firearm regulation. I believe we need to do both. I believe it's important enough that we do everything. It is very much a personal belief. I'm the father of a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old who someday will go to school, and the thought that they will be students at a school someday where they are worried about whether or not someone's going to bring a gun and shoot up the school is something that I just makes my heart break already inside. And I know there's students who live that reality right now. I didn't have that growing up, and I'm not that old. I mean, to my kids I have, but I'm not that old, and I didn't go through grade school and high school and college with the fear of a school shooting, or a mass shooting, or if I was out at a concert, if I were at a church or a synagogue, that someone would do this. And we have to do something about it. I believe my constituents want it. I believe most people recognize that we have a problem with guns in America. We have to do something about it. I also believe as a lawyer that there has been that the dominant voice in the gun debate is fundamentally dishonest. And again, I know I'm hammering the NRA a lot on this, but I think the NRA is a big part of the problem. It's a zero-sum game for them, which means all or nothing at all. And that's not healthy. We should be, like everything else in the world that we deal with, or everything else in the law, we should be talking about what's reasonable and what's not, as opposed to no way, no how versus the gun violence side becomes something called, the phrase we like to use a lot is common sense. But I don't think that moves the debate. I think we need to call out extremism for what it is. The idea that you're entitled to, that everybody in the world can just, whatever kind of guns or weapons they want, is just simply not true. And it's not something that's supported under the law. It's not what the Second Amendment says. It's not how the Second Amendment's been interpreted. So I think it's driven for me. The reason I'm behind so much of this is certainly personal beliefs. I want to protect my children. I want to protect the children of my district. I want to protect everybody in my district and in Pennsylvania. And I believe as a lawyer that we are absolutely within our constitutional mandate to do that. We can absolutely do that. And I think it's time, part of my mission will be, as I'm here, is to educate both constituents and other legislators that gun regulations do not violate the Second Amendment per se. Now, if you said something like no one can own a gun, any sort of gun whatsoever, except the one that you keep locked in your attic that you can never take out, like that would violate the Second Amendment, right?
Mm-hmm.
That would violate what Heller says. But we can have a discussion about what else can we do. We the same way the First Amendment, the Fourth, the Fifth, the Sixth, the Eighth, pretty much all of them have their checks on government power. But the government still has some of that power to protect people, to keep us safe. I mean, this is something we're all interested in, I believe. I believe deep down we all know there are limits that we can place on things like what kind of weapons you can buy or carry around on the street.
Mm-hmm.
I really believe that's there. That's just a common sense thing when you really get down to it.
Now, I guess going into the categories that we described before, I guess the first one is something that the listeners might be more familiar with. It's something that I think we've heard similar things at the federal level and maybe other states, and those are bills that are, I guess, geared towards limiting access to firearms in some respect. And it seems as though, and I know you mentioned Heller a few times, it seems as though having read through these bills, it seemed as though maybe you were almost taking guidance, and you correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm actually curious to hear. It seems as though you maybe have taken that opinion to a certain extent and seen, okay, where were the pitfalls there? How can we avoid those in these bills? But I guess to very roughly summarize them, one piece of legislation basically includes an assault weapons ban, in which 37 specific weapons are prohibited, along with other weapons meeting, I guess, certain specifications. There's legislation that, absent certain exceptions, limits one's ability to purchase a handgun to one every 30 days, and legislation that expands prohibitions on gun ownership among individuals who have been institutionalized at a mental health facility to also include those who have been required to participate in involuntary outpatient mental health services. Again, these are some bills that have made people may recognize, obviously not the exact same language, but at the federal level and other levels that maybe haven't garnered support as you described. This is something that people have been talking about. People have been making legislation for a long time now. Since Columbine, since Sandy Hook. I guess what makes these, in your opinion, different? And I guess when you were thinking about writing these, I guess what were you kind of keying in on? There's like eight questions. There's like eight questions in there. I'm sorry, I always do that.
No, that's right. There's a lot. But part of this, at the end of the day, when we're drafting legislation or when we're putting together legislation on this issue, there's some legislation that is put out there either by me or by someone else, where they know they probably don't have enough votes either to get it through a committee, whether it would even be brought up for a vote in committee or brought out to the floor of the House, whether it would gather a support of the majority. It's a whole political process just to get a bill to be considered. I mean, I think something people may not realize is that there are thousands of bills introduced every session in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives, and we don't vote on all of them. There's a process. When a bill gets introduced, it will get referred to a committee, but then it's up to basically the majority committee chair to decide whether they want to put that up for a vote in the committee. So that's one piece of agenda setting right there, or a policy agenda. And then if it comes out of committee, then it's still up to the majority whether they want to bring that vote up on the floor. And if it doesn't fit that policy agenda either, then it's not going to go up for a vote there either. I still think with some of those bills, knowing that we're putting out that wouldn't get majority support, they're still worth putting out there because of things like co-sponsorship, which show here are a number of legislators who support this bill. It also shows that the ideas that we believe in. It's important that people know that what your elected officials stand for. So I want people to know that we would support these laws. And if they do want to give them a vote, great. If these bills all get called for a vote, I would be a happy man. But I think, honestly, where the hurdles really get navigated, where this is really going to move is the more legislators put these out there and say, these are the bills that we care about. We want to run these bills. We want to vote on these bills. And candidates for office say, I support these bills. I want to run. We need to address gun violence with policy X, Y, and Z. And if we keep electing more people who are willing to stand behind these, and then the funny thing happens, politicians, a lot of politicians, if they see support is turning, or the tide is turning, then they'll jump on board too, because they don't want to be the last one saying no. But we've got to make this, I think political candidates have to make it an issue. They have to stand out and go, I stand for this. And I think over time, I'm an optimist on this. I believe it'll happen. People really talk about, we have the right to be free from gun violence. And here are some things we can do about it. And we make it an issue for voters and let them decide. And say, this candidate is stronger in this, and this candidate isn't. I believe voters make that an issue, and I believe it's becoming more and more and more of an issue for everyone. You will eventually see the composition, of the House and the Senate and Congress change. And when that happens, all of a sudden these votes that were sitting in committee never getting a vote will start getting votes. And you're seeing it already in the House to a certain extent. The domestic abuse bill last year, the PFA bill that passed, that was our first gun violence measure in, I think, a long, long time. Passed last session. Mm-hmm. And I'm hopeful that there's an emergency risk protection order bill that's been sponsored by Representative Stevens from the other side of the aisle, and I would love to see that get a vote. I'm optimistic that it could. Representative Stevens is on Judiciary with me, and I really hope that bill gets a chance to be heard. But it's slow climbing.
Mm-hmm.
Or tough sledding, or whatever metaphor you want to say. You learn that pretty quickly when you get there. That it's you don't get to show up and go, "Hey, I'm Mike Zabel, and listen, I'm a pretty big deal. Here's my bill. Vote for it." You got to build support.
Okay. I do want to transition to the other two groups, but I do
sure.
for people who are wondering, I do want to follow up on that politics thing, but I want the politics of it, and I guess the steep climb. I think your Ron Burgundy impression. I want to work back on that, but I want to kind of see how these next two questions, just so I can feel it out better. But I guess so. The second group is what I would describe as, I guess, gun safety measures, and that's something that you discussed about. And I'm curious as this, especially now that we've been talking for a few moments, because one requires locks when guns are not typically or are not physically on or near a person, and another is a 6-hour training requirement with I guess your buddies NRA approved professionals and those seeking to for those who are seeking a concealed permit. So I'm interested in, I guess, using the NRA in a way. I guess maybe it's an olive branch. Maybe that's something that maybe they'd just be best equipped to figure out, how best to train people. But I'm curious how those two measures that have been proposed kind of fit into what the discussion we've been talking about thus far.
Well, I think you're right with regards to the NRA approved professional. I think that's meant to be a bridge builder. And I don't necessarily oppose the professional having some sort of certification. That's how we pick who's doing the training. We obviously want somebody who knows what they're doing. And then, by the way, there are a lot of really responsible. I don't want to throw everybody who's associated with the NRA in with them just because they are a voice for gun manufacturers. There are a lot of really responsible handgun and gun owners who are members of the NRA and for good, legitimate reasons. So don't get me wrong on that.
No.
With regards to things like locks on guns, training, look, I think it just simply makes sense. A vehicle, think about how much time you had to spend in a vehicle or learning on a vehicle before you were able to drive it, because it is a tool that, if it's used incorrectly, could easily kill someone who's in its proximity. for me, it's as simple as that when it comes to a firearm. And then the objection to that is typically, well, it violates the Second Amendment. No, it doesn't. Training and training for a firearm is not an unreasonable requirement if you're going to operate a weapon that is designed to inflict harm upon someone. You should be able to do it responsibly. Pilots have to get trained. You have to get trained to operate it. You have to get training for boats, to operate boats and cars. I don't think it's out of line to say, look, if you want to learn how to fire a gun, you should get training. And by the way, most firearm owners who do it recreationally or using it in some sort of law enforcement capacity, they get training because, of course, you want to. You want to know how to operate a firearm properly, and it teaches responsibility. And then with the safe storage, that's, for me in particular, that's just a matter of children. That's what's really happens.
Mm-hmm.
The statistics, and I don't have them right at my fingertips, but the rate of incidents of death in a home when a firearm is in the home are sky high above houses where they do not. For me, it's a matter of protecting those people in particular, and also, frankly, not just children, but other people living in the house. It's just the incidence of mortality and accidents or acts of violence. They all shoot up, and it's not a coincidence that it's because there's a firearm in the home. So safe storage, I think, just makes sense. And I don't think it impedes your ability to own a handgun for self-defense.
And then finally, the final group is what I would describe, I guess, attempts to adapt laws to technology. And I'm curious about some of these, because there's a bill that you've sponsored that includes 3D printed firearms into Title F-18's definition of firearms and prohibiting such manufacturing, and also there's a separate bill that would prohibit undetectable firearms, and these are weapons that I think are described as those that can be disassembled in a manner that would pass through a metal detector. I think that the argument many gun control advocates have made has been that the Second Amendment kind of idea of a weapon has changed over 200 years, and maybe even the past few years. How do you and your colleagues, I guess for the lack of a better analogy, hit a moving target when the weapons that you're trying to legislate now, and the next question will be about that kind of slow climb you've described, where you might have a bill now, it might take a very long time to get that through, and then by the time it gets through, the weapons you're talking about are just different than they were when you first started.
That is really tough. It's definitely an issue. And in fact, I'm working on another bill that I haven't introduced yet, but plan to do it reasonably soon, that's related to the undetectable firearms thing, particularly with regard, I think it's Representative McCarter, I think, has introduced it, and Representative Sterla had the 3D printed firearms bill. And that's really scary when you think about it. I think even Second Amendment, the purest of Second Amendment extremists would have a hard time arguing against, you shouldn't be able to just print a gun at your home that isn't registered, that could be printed by anyone, including people that we all agree are not allowed to own firearms, and just use that as a weapon. That's a real problem. Mm-hmm. I am working on a bill that would outlaw what's commonly referred to as ghost guns, which are when you can buy a kit of parts that allows you to assemble the firearm yourself and essentially build your own assault weapon. It's the sale of those kits right now, or the sale of those parts, is not a crime in Pennsylvania. It is in other states, like New Jersey, for example, has a ghost gun statute, and that's what I'm looking at. I'm working on legislation that will model that. Because look, at the very least, I think, again, maybe I'm too optimistic here, but I think most people would agree. We need background checks. These guns need to have serial numbers, and we need to be able to, identify them to an owner, that sort of thing. We can't just have somebody get angry and go to their 3D printer and be able to do something horrible. So, but it is tough with technology. I will say the Second Amendment, with regards to that argument that the Second Amendment, the weapons have changed. I mean, the courts have dealt with this. I think it was in criminal procedure or constitutional law. I can't remember which, but Scalia wrote an opinion about using infrared technology to search the inside of a house.
Oh, it's CrimPro, yeah.
Yeah, CrimPro, right. And that was adapting. It was adapting the search and unreasonable search and seizures to new technology. So I believe the Constitution is written well enough to adapt to it. In regards to us keeping up with the legislation, with the technology on the legislation side, it's definitely a challenge, but bring it on. We have to. It's that important. We've got to do something about it. And it stuns me. I still can't quite believe that a 3D printer can make a gun. And we have to take steps to make sure that that's illegal.
And to follow up, I guess, on the past couple of questions, and I think even going back to your answer regarding 768 and how perhaps that's just not going to move forward, I guess, and I hope it's a fair question, and I think it's an obvious question, which you're referring to the politics being considered here, and the goal, I guess, to some extent, is to be aggressive on this front, to tell people what you believe in. To I guess give other people an opportunity to see what you and others believe in, to I guess shoot for kind of the goal and whatnot. But I guess my question would be, and I think it's an obvious question, is that's the long-term view, and it's perhaps the view that will get some of these things that you've described passed. I guess for other people, I wonder if they would at least ask the question, why not, or are there opportunities, or are they moving forward to make smaller changes incrementally that may have a better chance of getting passed? And I guess solving some of the questions that you get concerned with, as opposed to, and maybe or in coordination with, efforts to as your point, kind of build a consensus and build public support and build a legislature that focuses and is on the same page on this. I'm curious as to how maybe those goals work together, or maybe there's a strategy that I'm probably too ignorant to figure out. But I'm curious as to how that kind of all works out.
No, you're definitely not too ignorant to figure out. People are people, whether it's in the legislature, or when you're trying to get a group of friends to agree on something. It's there's nothing terribly different. It's not easy to change people's minds. This is part of what we as lawyers, particularly if you're on the litigation side, I guess, are doing, is trying to persuade people. So I don't mind that challenge, but people generally come into things with their principles and their notions of what they think are right and proper. And I think it's rare or not incredibly common for people to change their minds based on a single conversation or one good article or one really cogent Facebook post that you made on the topic. This is part of, and I talk about this sometimes with people about the internet. I have friends, and I used to be one of these people who argued on the internet with people. And someone asked me, "Have you ever seen someone change their mind on the internet?" I don't think I have. It takes time, but I do think we're if you can think of it as trying to turn around an aircraft carrier and get it pointed in the right direction, we've started to make a little bit of a turn towards reasonableness, not towards going in a completely opposite direction, but just in a new direction that accommodates both people who want to own a firearm lawfully and people who want to protect our kids and protect our public spaces and protect spouses and things like that. Which is why I think you saw last year the PFA bill, the Protection for Abuse Order bill passed. I'm optimistic this year that the Emergency Risk Protection Order bill could gather bipartisan support. I'm cautiously optimistic on that. I believe the background check loophole that we have in Pennsylvania right now, currently you don't need a background check for private sales or for long arms. I believe that's something that could be done. What I don't want to wait for is another tragedy. What happened in the last session is the Parkland shooting happened, and the House Judiciary Committee held a series of hearings on 14 bills, and nothing came out of it. Nothing came out of it. And I don't want to go through that dog and pony show. I don't want to just pay lip service to a problem and I don't want to wait on the next tragedy to be the impetus that drives people for change. So I believe this issue needs to be front and center all the time. That's part of the work that I try to do. So I think this issue needs to be front and center all the time. It's not going away. It's just like climate change. We can't. It's an issue, and I don't mean to jump.
No, but I mean, yeah.
But we can't afford to put these on the back burner. It's that important. We can. Climate change and gun violence are two things that. Look, a huge part of why I'm doing this, why I ran for office, why I got into office, is my kids. It's about making the world better for them than it is now. Making the world better, leaving the world in a better place. And I can't say yet that that's going to happen. But I want to make sure that I did my level best, more than my level best, my very best,
and I guess
to do something about it.
And so I understand what you're saying, and I appreciate your frustration with, I guess, not wanting to wait for the next tragedy. So I guess that kind of led into my question, where I guess, do you see this as a situation where basically the only way to do that is to take this longer term approach, because the opportunities for smaller changes, I guess changes that can be made, in shorter order at least, aren't there, because you mentioned it's very hard to get people to change their minds all of a sudden, or is that kind of what you're talking about in terms of the gun show loophole and those sorts of things, where maybe those are issues? I guess is it one or the other, or is there some, I guess, doing both at the same time?
Yes.
Okay.
I think it is if I knew exactly the best way to do it, I'd be doing it.
Sure.
I'll tell you. So I'm willing to try all of it. It's not unlike when I was running for office for the first time last year. There is no running for office for dummies. There's no book. If there were, I would have bought it. But you don't know. Or let me put it this way: I didn't know what things I was doing that were good and what things I was doing that were not effective. And you kind of all get graded on one day when you're running for office. Then
Sure.
There's an election day, and you find out whether the stuff you're doing is right or wrong, and all of that. Where I see this when it comes to gun violence, I think there's going to be a tipping point at some point where in Pennsylvania, where people the majority of the legislators, the majority of the populace say, okay, we're going to take some real serious action. But I think to get to that tipping point, there needs to be incremental achievements along the way.
Mm-hmm.
So the question as an advocate is, or as a legislator, whatever it is are you advocating for those increments, or are you advocating for everything? Which moves people, which is more effective? I don't know. I will say I think we need more. I do think we need more people advocating for strong positions. I think we have the incremental market is pretty well covered. There are a lot of gun violence groups that are addressing, moderate Republicans and go, oh, look, they support this bill, and that's great. That work is being done. But I think we also need an equally strong voice going, well, also, why do we need AR-15s being sold to civilians in a matter of 15 minutes? Like, why do we need that? Why should there be guns that you can make in printers?
Sure.
There need to be people who are aggressive in it, and I have, for the moment, I think my position is I better fill the position of being one of those aggressive legislators who say, well, what about these laws? Let's talk about these laws, knowing that there are people who are working on the incrementalist approach.
Sure, and I certainly don't mean to question. I was just asking for my own education on how that kind of works. Now, I guess.
Oh yeah, no. I'm learning it as I go.
No. And I guess with that, and you mentioned, I guess, you believe that there will be a turning point in Pennsylvania, and I'm curious because one of the reasons why we're very happy to have you join us is because the gun control debate is not just in Pennsylvania. It's not just one or two bills. It's a national thing, and given the recent tragedy in New Zealand, an international something that everyone's focused on. And you made the example of climate change, but and I think that is kind of apt because obviously these are issues that are apples and oranges, but we do have similar conversations about same-sex marriage years ago and legalization of marijuana and now sports gambling, where things kind of percolate on the federal level, and then ultimately you see a greater urgency and greater change at the state level, either by successfully passing bills or maybe even public rejection, or as you mentioned, there's a whole political process that maybe some of us don't really understand or aren't aware of. Do you see gun legislation following a similar path as maybe same-sex marriage, for instance, in which the individual states kind of serve as a barometer for public opinion, and maybe even places where there is incremental or in some cases large change?
That's a really good question. It's a question that gives me some optimism if that proves to be the case. I think you could see it to a certain degree. You saw after Parkland, Florida, taking some steps that I think and passing some bills that you might not have expected before Parkland to come out of Florida. I've actually used the same-sex marriage analogy when it comes to gun violence as well. In that I think if you were interviewing me as a legislator 20 years ago, if I had taken office when I was 20 years old, and said, do you think there'll ever come a day where same-sex marriage will be recognized in all 50 states? I would have said, boy, I don't see it. I would believe it's right, but I'm not sure when that day is coming. But I think with same-sex marriage in particular, there was just a tipping point.
Sure.
And I don't know exactly where. I can't identify where that was, but I do think it coming from the states and it garnering state support is part of. It trickles up, actually, I think, to the Supreme Court. In regards to guns, I still see a long path in front of us. I think we have a long way to go. I can't believe that it's a long way to go because I'm so already there.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's also important to be respectful of people who are apprehensive about what this means. There are people who have real fears and real concerns about government overstep, and that's always a good thing to have. I think. I mean, I am a progressive, but I'm a lawyer first, and I do believe they're important. It's important to be concerned about governmental overreach. With that said, I think we have to undo some of the irrational fear that has been done by an extremist lobby, and start to have real conversations about this, and start talking about it rationally, and recognize that I want a portion of the country to recognize that they're being used. They're being used to sell guns. That's what a lot of the Second Amendment debate is right now, or the gun violence debate is. It's people being manipulated to sell guns, and that's detracting from a good, honest conversation. And once we have that national conversation, I think we're having it to a certain extent, but if we keep pushing it, we might find that's where I think we'll find real, true common ground. And it may not be the consensus that we build towards someday, either across the country, state by state, or nationally through laws. I think it is more likely to come state by state, to answer your question. But it may not be. We may not come to rest at a middle ground that I completely agree with. But it can't be much worse than it is right now, which is essentially we don't do anything. We throw up our hands, and I think people are pretty tired of hearing the thoughts and prayers mantra. I think people are pretty tired about we need to take action and then not hearing anything. And God forbid another tragedy happens in Pennsylvania, or what happened with the Tree of Life is just in Pittsburgh. I don't know how much more people can take, but like I said, one of the reasons I fight for this is I do not want us to get used to this.
Sure.
We must not get used to it.
And I guess talking about the states, and this is our last, I guess, substantive question, which is, I guess I'm curious as to, you mentioned earlier that you were looking at bills in New Jersey, for instance, for guidance, for seeing how their states are moving on this. I guess I'm curious because, this is an issue on both sides of the aisle in neighboring states. Obviously, the complexities of this gun debate, I would imagine that, finding something that solves everything or means everything to everyone or is, useful when, especially here in Philadelphia, where you can just cross the border to New Jersey, cross the border to Delaware. Obviously in Pittsburgh, you can do that same thing with Ohio. I'm curious, I guess, how you interact or seek guidance from either your colleagues in Harrisburg or maybe even colleagues in neighboring states.
Well, So New Jersey is pretty much the opposite. I know you mentioned you're a native of New Jersey to me before we started the interview.
Yes.
New Jersey is pretty much on the opposite side of the political spectrum to Pennsylvania when it comes to gun violence laws. So, but what I do like to do there, or what I like to look around, is imagine you get elected to the legislature for the first time, and okay, you don't come in with specific ideas for 800 laws, or maybe some people do. But I like to look around and say, all right, well, what works? What are some good ideas? You read the paper, you talk to groups. Talk to your constituents. Okay, what kind of things work? And I wasn't aware, for example, maybe I was naive of this idea with regards to ghost gun law. I wasn't even aware of the ability that you could buy these parts and assemble an assault weapon yourself. Well, that seems to me crazy. That seems to be what. And when I learned that New Jersey had done it, I said, okay, well, let me see. I want to read their version of this law. I saw that they had made some arrests under the law, and I wanted to see how it worked. Because I don't automatically buy into everything I read about. I want to say, okay, let me go see if this will work. I'm a lawyer. I want to parse the statute and see if it can work. And then once you take it, you've got to, if you said you want to go with it, you've got to implement it into Pennsylvania's crimes code or into whatever particular statute you want to do. You got to make sure it works and it's fair, because it will be constitutionally challenged by somebody for sure. It's just a certainty. So you want to make sure it holds up and it's not an undue burden, to use a legal phrase. Another gun bill that I have introduced is the one handgun a month bill, which was not about. It's about capping the illegal handgun market, where people use straw purchasers and they can buy multiple handguns at a time, and that facilitates an illegal gun dealer from selling guns en masse, which is what happens. And Pennsylvania is one of the places where it's easiest to do straw purchases and flood the market with illegal guns. And so the one firearm a month thing is not the problem. The problem is not people who are buying 3 handguns a month to defend themselves. But when I wrote that law, I had to make sure, well, let's say Tom Smith buys a handgun in January 1 for protection in his home. And then he loses it, or it breaks or something, and it's still January. Well, we want to make sure he's not somebody I'm looking to target with this law. So we had to write an exception for that.
Sure.
And then you have to look at instances like, well, what if somebody has to purchase a handgun and gets a job with law enforcement that he's going to use for that? Well, then that would apply to that. What about corrections facilities? Does that apply to them? You look at and you got to write all these things to make sure that you're not overreaching. That's what I make a real effort with that, to make sure that I'm not into blanket prohibitions. I want to make sure with an assault weapon ban that we have the appropriate definition, and that it's not going to affect sportsmen and women, like their ability to use a rifle that they use for hunting. Hunting isn't my thing, but I'm not looking to take anybody's ability to hunt away. That just I don't think will ever happen. Nor should it. There are a lot of people for whom that's a great passion and interest, and they do it safely, and I really respect that. But it's a process of you survey around, you talk to people, you look for good ideas. It's like anything else. Like a good business innovates, but also borrows from the people who came before them that best practices. You can innovate and you can do. You borrow and you try to do both. I try to find, if I'm looking at legislation, I try to find stuff that's either from local areas, local states or neighboring states, or states that are purplish like Pennsylvania.
Sure.
Because we're in a minority right now. If I come out with something, oh, look what they came up with in California, they'll go. They're probably, that's not the best selling point. That's not the best point to be starting with.
Understood.
In the Pennsylvania General Assembly.
And then finally, I'd like to wrap up this podcast as we have in our past recordings, basically with a kind of a catch-all question. And I think this every topic we've talked about thus far on the podcast, and particularly this one, these are issues that a lot of people are talking about with their family at the dinner table, with their friends at the bar, what have you. And I'm curious, that I can only assume, I know it's true in my life, where the gun control debate is being talked about among friends and family, and people are talking about on both sides of the issue, in the middle, both about Harrisburg, both about DC, internationally. Um, I'm curious as to one or two things that we haven't talked about yet that you hope when these conversations are happening, that you hope that is kind of coming up, either because you think it's particularly important, either because you think it's particularly interesting as a lawyer, as a legislator. I guess what are those things in your mind?
Sure. One I mentioned a little bit already, which is climate change. I think climate change is one of the defining and most pressing issues of our time, and we've got to do something about it. We've got to start taking action. This isn't something that we're already probably a little too far, a little farther, not a little. We're farther along or further along in the problem than I would like to be. But we've got to take action. We've got to do that now. We've got to think about our carbon emissions. We've got to think about how we are going to shift to cleaner energy, or to clean energy, to renewable energy. That is a major issue that affects all of us, affects every single one of us. And for any of us who have children, or are going to have children, or care what the environment is like in 30 years, we have to do something about it. We really have to. I think it's undeniable. Climate change is universally accepted in the scientific community, and it's really past the point of debate. The only question is now, what are we going to do about it? So that is one. And then I think the other big issue, but I think it's all sort of interrelated, but the question of the costs of college and career and technical education, and what the future of our economy is going to look like for the vast majority of people, and particularly the middle class. College has gotten so expensive, and you'll be graduating law school. I don't know your financial situation, but I graduated law school with some debt, which and Temple's not that bad with it because it's a state tuition. But college, we're learning, isn't for everybody, and maybe for some people, career and technical education can put them on a more prosperous path. I'm really concerned about the middle class in the country, and building and expanding that, and making that more robust, because I think the economic gap between the haves and the have-nots is ever widening, and we've really got to figure out a way to grow good middle-class jobs, and where do those lie, and how can we do it? And I think, for example, one area that offers great potential for the future and good middle-class jobs is renewable, clean energy. And that's something that can, I think, work. It can help solve two problems, not conclusively solve, but at least be a part of the solution: jobs and the environment. Well, we've got to think forward. We can't think. I think too many politicians think about, or some politicians think about just how they're going to win their next election. And I'm up for election next year. It starts all over again. It drives me crazy. Yeah, it's every 2 years, just like Congress. And there's a good part of that, and there's a bad part of that. But the good part of it is voters get to have a say every 2 years, and whether you stay or you go. The bad part is it's easy to get distracted and just for politicians to start to think, oh, now I've got to run up. All I'm thinking about is re-election. We need to be thinking, and so they're thinking about next year, or they're thinking about this year, depending on whether it's an odd or an even. We should be thinking about 10 years. We should be thinking about 20 years. We should be thinking about 30 years. We should be thinking about the stuff that we do now, the bills that we vote, or the policies we put in place now, are going to have a huge shape on the future. On the future when they don't get, I'm not going to be state rep forever. Along with my name is a distant memory, some of the stuff that we're putting in place will be impacting our environment, our economy, our safety, and I think we need to have that long view. It's not the most immediately rewarding. People don't clap you on the back and say, great job on taking the long view. But you've got to be willing to do it, because that's what public service is. That's what I think Dean Epps was calling us to do.
So, well, Representative Zabel, I know we took up a lot of your time this afternoon, but really do appreciate it. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Take care.
It was fun. All right. Bye-bye.